I believe it was Quentin Tarantino who once said the A in George A. Romero stood for George a fucking genius Romero. This year, the legendary horror director, whose influence is still present in the modern zombie mythos, passed away at the age of 77. As a fan of horror, this was incredibly sad to hear, just as it was to be notified of Wes Craven's death 2 years ago. Now that we're in October, I should probably have a look at some scary movies, and I should definitely start by looking at the original Living Dead films in memory of one of the icons of the genre that left us this year. I might well have a look at Land of the Dead, through to Survival of the Dead, his final film, at some point. But for now, I'm going to focus on the big three: Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. First of all, I should draw attention to the fact that, unlike the later films, it's fairly easy to watch Night of the Living Dead online if you're interested. It fell into the public domain a few years back, so there's a ridiculous amount of videos, DVDs and Blu-rays that exist, not to mention an upcoming 4K remaster. Pick your poison, Barlows and Vamps. But on to the first one. Night of the Living Dead could be seen as the odd one out when you look at the trilogy, and I use that term loosely, as a whole, from a visual standpoint. I'd say that's because it's in black and white. I think this works in the film's favour though, giving it the look of a classic chiller, and its odd moments, though odd, I find reminiscent of the famous Bela Lugosi White Zombie. Strange that I mention two different types of zombie film. I don't think modern audiences would really get the film, if you know what I mean. It's fairly slow, even though it's a lot shorter than the films that come out nowadays, and because there's this stupid stigma surrounding the lost art of black and white cinema that I totally disagree with. So you might look back on it and have a titter, but remember, a lot of the zombie horror you take for granted today would not have been possible without George and Co.'s efforts. Though you could easily bemoan the acting in the film, I personally feel that horror is most effective when a lot, though not always all, of the cast aren't faces you immediately recognise. For instance, Dwayne Jones and Judith O'Dea, or is it O'Day? I'm not sure about that. They were unknown before this and are still best remembered as Ben and Barbara from Night of the Living Dead. I have to say, I'm reminded an awful lot of the classic Universal films watching this, the music, atmosphere, and the graveyard in the beginning. I imagine George would have been influenced by these films, and it appears that way from his homage to them at the beginning of his 2005 installment, Land of the Dead. My only issue with the film is down to Barbara as a character. The story forgets she's there, and Barbara is pretty much useless when she has to defend herself and the house she's occupying. It's still a very daring, nihilistic piece of work nearly 5 decades later. Dawn of the Dead came 10 years after and has been put upon such a pedestal by the horror community and Film One as well. Rightly so, I believe. This film is a step up from Romero's original. It's in colour, allowing for some theatrically over-the-top violence, brought beautifully to life by Tom Savini, and it takes the saying from an old house to a shopping centre, which isn't bad, actually. They utilise it well. And there are star-making turns from the likes of Ken Foree, David Emge and Scott Reiniger, who, like Ben before them, are extremely endearing and provide some levity in a very dark world. Dawn of the Dead also has one of the best musical scores, discounting the stock music I've heard in horror. This comes from the band Goblin, whose main theme is a great example of the genre on the same level as John Carpenter's music, Christopher Young, Philip Glass and the rest, and though I have every bit of respect for its predecessor, I find myself watching this one more. I'm well aware that Day of the Dead didn't get the most positive response from fans when it first came out in '85. This idea can colour your first impression going into something, but I say it's better to go in and see it for yourself. After all, what the majority dislike, you might prefer, and vice versa. Back to my point. I can understand the disappointment at the time. The films that precede Day left a great impression when they dropped in '68 and '78, and here we have the tricky third installment with the potential to be greater crap that is juxtaposed against a decade famous for slasher films that were in many ways more graphic. I say it's the most logical end to the original three. We previously had only the pedestrian's perspective, now we have the military and science one. The film is equally creative in how it uses gore. Now, Tom Savini's work isn't as vibrant as in Dawn of the Dead, but it feels appropriate for the decade it was made in, and that's a point I'll return to. Captain Rhodes and Bub, played by Joseph Pilato and Sherman Howard respectively, are easily the best things about it, and Pilato's death screaming, "Choke on him!" as he's eviscerated by the living dead, has some staying power, as well as Howard's Bub, the zombie who slowly regains his humanity, which I think is such a fascinating concept. I think what makes these films resonate with people, and particularly my generation of horror fans, is that they're as much a time capsule of the eras they were made in as they are important works. And doing so, they have a great variety. Now, normally it would be a criticism to say that the films don't cohere. There aren't returning characters, in the case of The Living Dead. But I think that's for the best. I've always seen them as anthology pieces, different stories that just so happen to deal with the same idea of zombie apocalypse, and George Romero shares that viewpoint also. Romero's films have notably spawned in-depth analyses of themes. When you consider how dismissive people can be of horror films, it's fascinating to learn that people have taken zombie films to heart. My cousin famously wrote a thesis in college about the deeper meanings of the underlying meanings behind the films, from Night to Survival, I believe. Of course, George Romero did intend it in the films, so there's that. I'm going in and out of scripted and improvised. These films are held in high regard, and that's deserved. And a lot of it is down not only to the really good cast of actors, but to the late George Andrew Romero, without whom we wouldn't have such a recognisable subgenre still active today. I don't think that such a wonderful comedy like Shaun of the Dead or even Zombieland would have been possible without his influence. As surreal as it can be to say these words, I must. Rest in peace to the godfather of the dead, and thank you for all the movies.